Today, I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a video game studio that was, at one point in time, very important to me, and who at this point don't really exist anymore. It's a story about the rise and fall of that studio, which started out with just a handful of people, but eventually grew to over 400 strong. To some, they were single-handedly responsible for revitalizing a once dormant genre. They won Game of the Year awards up against other studios with developers numbering in the thousands, and games with marketing budgets measured in the millions. They've been one of gaming's greatest success stories, and within the span of one bad week, it all just went away. This story is both a tragedy and a parable, an example of the highest highs and lowest lows of game development, and a cautionary tale for those of us still around to hear it. Today, I want to tell you the story about the death of Telltale Games. I've been playing video games for as long as I can remember. So long, in fact, that I can't even recall what the first game I ever played was. Games are just something that have been ever-present throughout my entire life, but they never fully defined me either. They were just one of many things I loved as a kid, and like I assume is true for a lot of us, as we grow up, not all of our interests stick with us forever. Although I never really imagined myself living in a world where I never played a video game ever again, as I went to college and was approaching my 20s, that boyhood love was starting to fade into the background a bit. It was becoming a casualty of not enough time and too many other interests. But that all changed in 2012 when I played the first episode of Telltale's The Walking Dead. I hadn't played a true adventure game since the days of Freddy Fish or Pajama Sam, and while I had played games with stories I truly loved, like the Mass Effect trilogy, I had never played a game quite like this before. The Walking Dead wasn't just a game with an emphasis on story and interesting choices. It was a game only about story and choices. Before The Walking Dead, I was beginning to see myself as someone whose core interests just didn't really align with the kinds of games studios wanted to make, and more importantly, the kinds of games players wanted to play. But now, after experiencing that first episode, I didn't feel so alone anymore. If there were people somewhere who believed in games as a medium for storytelling so much that they would make a game whose core mechanic was nothing but the narrative, well then presumably there might be even more people like me out there who wanted to play a game like that too. So in that sense, the success of The Walking Dead, in a very small way, felt like my success. All of its many accolades and Game of the Year awards were validation for the way I saw games. It meant that there were hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of other people who felt the same as me, who just wanted a good story out of their games. I had to play more games like this, and luckily for me, Telltale was more than willing to accommodate. I moved on to Telltale's next game, The Wolf Among Us, as soon as it was released. As I had done with The Walking Dead before it, after completing each episode, I made a habit of running to the forums on Telltale's official website to vote in the fan-run poll about when the next installment would be released. This was mostly a well-meaning affair, with only a few jerks in there to complain about the devs taking too long. Sure, we all would have loved more solid dates for the next eagerly anticipated episode, but we also understood these things took time. More than anything, these forum posts were another sign of just how invested we all were with this type of storytelling. The Wolf Among Us was never quite as successful as The Walking Dead from either a critical or financial perspective, but it was still beloved by us, the diehard fans. And as our appetite for more story-driven games grew, so did Telltale's portfolio of licensed IPs. The next 2 years alone, from 2014 to 2016, saw Telltale release full seasons of Game of Thrones, Tales from the Borderlands, Minecraft, and Batman, as well as a second season of The Walking Dead and a mini spin-off season for that series, which followed the character Michonne. And let me tell you, I was dead set on playing every single one of these games. After all, this is what I'd asked for. This is what I had been craving. But as it turned out, in this particular case, that old adage of be careful what you wish for turned out to be mostly true. In going back to play some of these games for this video, many of which I hadn't played since they were originally released, I've gained a new appreciation for what Telltale put out during this time. While there were a couple series that still felt like they either poorly fit into Telltale's house style, or just tried too hard to replicate the formula that made the first season of The Walking Dead so successful, there were still a ton of games that were genuinely really good. But the truth is, back when I was in the middle of devouring literally everything Telltale released, I was starting to feel burnt out by the studio's rapid output. There was just so many episodes to play at any given time, and after a while, this started to have a blurring effect on how you viewed these games. If you played enough of their games back to back, the formulas and structures they were built on started to surface themselves, and they made the experiences feel more overtly artificial than you would have liked. And while I was lucky enough to never experience this firsthand, there was the persistent issue of episodes being released with all sorts of bugs, ranging from save files not being carried over to just general poor performance all around. And I haven't even mentioned another big problem that, to be honest, I do feel a bit embarrassed to confess now, but there was always a bit of disappointment when a new series would come out and it never felt quite as revolutionary as that first season of The Walking Dead, especially that season's direct sequel. So eventually, over the course of playing so many of Telltale's games, I just sort of lost a lot of that original passion I'd found back in 2012. And if the studio's consistently dwindling sales figures were any indicator, I wasn't the only one. For one reason or another, many of us just fell off the bandwagon altogether. The next 2 years after that saw even more releases: Guardians of the Galaxy, a second season for Batman and Minecraft, a third season for The Walking Dead, as well as further announced plans for a second season of Game of Thrones and The Wolf Among Us, in addition to an adaptation of Netflix's Stranger Things. It felt like Telltale had single-handedly saturated its own market. And so now, as a lapsed fan, I watched from afar as the studio I once cherished slowly declined. I think at one point I had heard something about layoffs at the studio, which was sad to hear about, but nothing I had heard about the actual games they had been putting out made me feel compelled to come back either. That is, until around August of 2018. Telltale had just released the first episode of what was supposed to be the final season of The Walking Dead, and the reviews were, surprisingly, pretty positive. They gave the appearance of a studio that was finally moving out from the shadow of that first season of the series, and I was actually looking forward to playing it. That being said, partially due to still feeling a bit burnt out, I had decided to play it safe and wait until the episodes were finished before I jumped back in. But I was genuinely excited with the prospect of Telltale finishing up the series with the care and quality both that game and that studio deserved. And then, about a month later, everything went very, very wrong. On Friday, September 21st, 2018, a week before the second episode of that final season was to be released, Telltale employees showed up to work, and by the time they left the office, nearly all of them had lost their jobs. News spread to fans online, first through social media posts by employees, and was soon thereafter followed up by news outlets like Kotaku. For a significant chunk of time there, everything seemed pretty chaotic and up in the air. Did the entire studio shut down, or was this just another round of partial layoffs? What did this mean for the still incomplete final season of The Walking Dead, or any of Telltale's other announced titles for that matter? And probably the most confounding question of them all, how the hell did this even happen? The answer to that last question wasn't immediate. It took days or even weeks to really get the full picture of how exactly everything had come to this. In some ways, we're still piecing together the final details of this story. But it's a story that I, like I assume many other fans, wanted to know, and that's the next story I want to tell to you now. But before I go any further, I should put this disclaimer out there first. I am not by any means an investigative journalist, and I did not at any time ever work at Telltale Games. As I mentioned up top, I'm simply a fan, and as a fan, all I'm really trying to do is compile as much information as I can into one succinct vision, to tell one complete story as best I can. My overall goal with this video is just to try and answer a few simple questions about the shutdown of Telltale Games. Namely, what happened, why did it happen, and if possible, how can we prevent this from happening in the future? So with that in mind, I will be needing to rely on the work of many other people who are professional journalists, who have covered this story, and have talked to the people who actually worked there. I will be citing claims made by former employees, some rather damning about certain members of Telltale's management. It should be noted that many of these sources remained anonymous, usually out of fear for retaliation, as presumably most, if not all of them, were looking for new jobs at the time. And it is true, employees that were already unhappy with the working conditions at the studio would be the most likely candidates to come forward with these types of accusations. But I trust the journalists that reported on this story, and thus I trust their sources. Whether you choose to is ultimately out of my hands. So now, with all these necessary grains of salt out of the way, let me take you back in time to just a few years earlier. There is a saying in games media that if you, a player, find an issue with a game, in most cases, the developers are already well aware of it, and after reading what the people who actually work there had to say, it sounds like that was exceedingly true about Telltale Games. In a lot of ways, it seemed like the success of the first season of The Walking Dead was largely a double-edged sword for the studio. in that it was both the catalyst that opened the door for all the opportunities that were to come, while simultaneously being seen by management as a secret formula that, when replicated, would lead the studio on to even more success. Or, as one former employee put it, the folks at the very top never really understood what made Walking Dead work. They were given a recipe book and they just follow the recipe because they don't really understand why the recipe tastes good. After finishing The Wolf Among Us and releasing a second season of The Walking Dead, the tail end of 2014 saw the first instance of Telltale shipping simultaneous releases of two different series, Game of Thrones and Tales from the Borderlands. The increased release schedule was part of the studio's new strategy to put out more episodes more often, but this plan also came with some obvious drawbacks. Primarily that this not only risked overwhelming their audience with too much content, but it also essentially doubled the team's normal workload. Not oblivious to this potential problem, the studio tried to accommodate by hiring on more employees to help with the higher demand, but even that turned out to have unintended consequences. Because management was dead set on using Telltale's own proprietary engine, commonly referred to as the Telltale tool, most new employees would have to be trained upon hiring, since almost none of them would have any prior experience working with the engine. And the decision to stick with this engine didn't just add extra time investment up front, but also throughout the development of a project. The Telltale tool was originally created along with the studio's founding in 2004, and by most accounts was more than capable of handling the tasks it was originally created to perform. But as time wore on, the engine quickly started to show its age, one of the biggest issues being that until sometime around 2016, it didn't even have a physics engine. This meant that something as simple as a bottle rolling across the floor would need to be hand animated, which of course translates to needing more development time. These poor management decisions alone would make it hard to get a game out on time and at an acceptable quality, but sadly this isn't the end of Telltale's problems. Along with the general stress of having to work with outdated technology, there were regular executive review meetings that were described as adding even more stress to an already tense situation. These meetings with leadership were described as being long, drawn-out arguments where shouting and belittling comments were not unusual, and often led to rewrites and reworking significant chunks of episodes.
There was no warning. You go into the executive review and they take a giant turd on you. That was your feedback. We hate this thing you made.
I remember hearing one of my bosses say, "I love that we can just shout at each other and curse at each other in a meeting. It's totally great." I didn't feel that way at all. It sucks. I don't want to work every day where I have to yell at people and scream to have my voice heard. I think a lot of people burned out that way.
The obvious consequence to all these revisions and poor management was that the staff was often overworked. Employees were reportedly spending anywhere from 50 to 80 hours a week at the studio, working on weekends, and foregoing vacations or taking paid time off. Once you start to stack all these issues together, it begins to paint a picture that, if I can insert myself back into the story again and give my own outsider opinion, sounds like absolute hell.
Executives would often ask teams to rewrite, redesign, recast, and reanimate up until the very last minute without properly adjusting the schedule. The demands on production only became more intense with each successful release, and at some point you just don't have anything left to give.
Needless to say, Telltale had fallen into a textbook example of what is commonly referred to in the tech industry as crunch culture. Unfortunately for many game studios, crunch is not an uncommon thing to experience. But if there is one silver lining when compared to Telltale in particular, it's that for those other studios, crunch usually only happens in the last few months leading up to a big release. But for the employees at Telltale, because of the company's new, almost relentless release schedule, for them the crunch was effectively never ending. Unsurprisingly, this created serious levels of burnout throughout the staff, and eventually led to people leaving the company altogether.
You'd get a lot of people coming right out of school going, "Oh, I really want to prove myself, and I really want to make sure that they see that I'm contributing." The thing that broke my heart the most was seeing new team members that were so gung-ho and optimistic and excited to be at Telltale get overused and abused because they did not feel comfortable drawing the line in the sand to say, "This is my limit." They either worked themselves out and would get sick or would become bitter.
Every time a senior staff member left, that was valuable experience, leadership, and knowledge walking out the door. And every introductory level employee that got burnt out and quit meant spending even more time hiring and training someone to replace them. That, or just trying to get by with being constantly understaffed. Either way, all the departures were starting to add up. Probably the highest profile departure was that of Jake Rodkin and Sean Vanneman. The duo had been co-leads on the first season of The Walking Dead, and were regarded both internally and externally as one of the biggest reasons for that season's success, primarily because they were one of the few team members with enough clout to push back against management. but they were far from the only noteworthy people to leave. Along with Vanneman and Rodkin, who left to found their own studio, Campo Santo, and release the game Firewatch, Adam Hines left to co-found Night School Studio, which would later release Oxenfree, and in 2017, 4 more members of Telltale left to start recently announced Ad Hoc Studios. And all of these studios have released or are currently developing adventure games in a similar vein to Telltale. In other words, creating even more competition in a market Telltale themselves had already nearly flooded. And so with all these people leaving, this is where we need to talk about co-founder and eventual CEO of the studio, Kevin Bruner. According to some, as soon as Rodkin and Vanneman left, Bruner tried to step into the power vacuum that the two had left behind.
He was hesitant to give anyone much credit for having significant creative vision. He thought they would leave and become a competitor, because he had a couple of strong examples of people doing exactly that. There was a dark period of time where, if you were in charge of a project, you were not getting any interviews. He's going to be the one on the panel, he's going to be the one doing the interviews, he's going to be the one in the magazine.
Around the office, he had earned the reputation as a micromanager, although according to Bruner, he was simply trying to make sure Telltale's games all had a consistent vision. But regardless of his intentions, this approach to management left a lot of people feeling creatively stifled.
He wanted to be consulted on everything, from the color of the walls to who they've hired to write specific dialogue.
It often felt like we were building games specifically for him. We were tailoring the type of content we were building, not just gameplay mechanics, but tone, the types of characters we chose to use, to his taste. This was one of the biggest issues with him as a CEO. He was pretty convinced that his taste was everyone's taste.
And it's at this point that I feel like we've basically reconstructed the other side of the coin from my experience as a fan of these games. The stress and limitations of game development under so many poor decisions and general misconduct was resulting in games that felt at times rushed, unpolished, and repetitive. With this in mind, it's hard not to assume that the bright spots from this period in the studio's history were probably the games that were getting less attention from the leadership team overall, resulting in designers being given more freedom to experiment. But all of this also leads me to wonder, even though there were some that did end up leaving the company, why did so many more decide to stay? Well, the simplest answer I could find seems to be that they just wanted to make good games. They knew the conditions they were working in were egregiously unfair, but they also had a passion for making games, especially the kinds of games only Telltale made. It's important to remember, there's a reason why when I first played The Walking Dead, it felt so original. That's because there just weren't many other games out there like it. And although some of the people that had splintered off from Telltale had begun creating their own studios, those were still fairly small enterprises, consisting of only a dozen or so employees at most, and nowhere near the size needed to be a legitimate alternative source of employment for the now nearly 400 workers Telltale had ballooned to. So they put their head down and tried to do the best they could working within a fundamentally broken system. And they did it at least partially for us, the fans. And to say I feel conflicted about this would be putting it pretty mildly. But we'll have to delve into that more later on. For now, we still have a story to finish. Although it didn't last forever, the now ironic truth is that, even in the lead up to the studio's untimely demise, there was actually a rising sense of hope among the staff who had stuck with the company. In early 2017, Bruner stepped down as CEO of the company, although it was later reported that he was actually voted out by the board of directors instead of voluntarily leaving of his own accord. Bruner's exit was the start of what was supposed to be a rebound for the studio, and in the fall of that year they hired on a new CEO, Pete Howley. Under the new leadership, Telltale was committing to putting out fewer and better games, and even announced they would be moving on from the Telltale tool in favor of the much more ubiquitous Unity engine. All in all, it looked like things were headed in the right direction. But these changes didn't come without some casualties. In November of 2017, Telltale laid off 90 employees, equating to roughly 25% of their staff. While many who had survived the cuts were sad to see their colleagues go, the move was largely seen as a necessary evil, the end result of years of poor decision-making by previous management. Now leaner and more resilient than ever, Telltale was ready to start over and get back to delivering the types of games they believed only they could make. And for a while there, it seemed like they just might do it. But unfortunately, we already know that isn't how this story ends. To say that the people of Telltale felt blindsided by their studio's sudden closure in September of 2018 doesn't appear to even come close to doing it justice. What started off as just a regular Friday quickly changed when employees were abruptly notified there would be an emergency meeting later that day.
Immediately, my thought was, this is either really good that they had to call an emergency meeting, or it's really bad.
I've never heard that room so silent. You could hear a pin drop.
At the meeting, Hawley announced that the company had run out of money and that, with the exception of a small skeleton crew staying on to oversee the final shutdown, everyone was being laid off, effective immediately. But the bad news didn't stop there. Because of the studio's strained financial situation, there would be no severance packages, and their healthcare would be running out at the end of the month. Everyone was handed folders with information about unemployment and sent on their way. Just like that, it was all over.
The way that it was said was that it was almost like an assurance. Don't worry, you have healthcare until the end of the month. Just remember thinking, fuck, that's only 9 days. What the fuck am I gonna do after that happens?
I was living paycheck to paycheck.
It was over in a half hour. Some loitered for a bit after to get their immediate belongings and say goodbye, but it was pretty quick. It was like a one-and-done sort of thing.
Telltale was located in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I can attest to from first-hand experience is not only one of the most expensive places to live in the United States, but also the world. Some employees had reportedly just started working at the studio that week, and anyone who had been hired on as contractors would be unable to file for unemployment altogether. At least one new hire had been said to have moved across the country to work there, while another was only in the country because of a work visa that was conditional on their job still existing. And with next to no warning, in the span of one 30-minute meeting, all of them were left to put their life back together without any help from the company they had uprooted their lives to come work for. And this is where our two perspectives, that of the fan and that of the game maker, start to intertwine, because from this point on, no one really knew what the future of Telltale would look like. Now former employees were left wondering how they were going to pay their bills and cover rent for the next month. And fans were left wondering when or even if they were going to get to see the end of The Walking Dead. Now, obviously, the severity of these two situations aren't really comparable, but as I already attested to, these were games that people really got invested in, which unfortunately led to, I'll just be nice and say, unnecessary tension being added to the whole situation. Especially at the beginning, Telltale the company was being fairly tight-lipped about what was going to happen with their already announced titles, presumably because they genuinely didn't have those answers yet. But this also left fans with no good place to ask questions and vent their frustrations. But plenty of the people who had worked at Telltale were frequently posting to their own social media accounts about their own frustrations with recent events, which resulted in many of the former staff members being inundated with questions from fans that ranged from sincere but tone-deaf to frankly lacking any sort of common human decency. It turned out that, due to Telltale's relative silence on the matter, they had done one last disservice to their employees, as now, even after being laid off by the company, many of them were being unwillingly forced into the role of PR for their now former employer. Even being barraged with well-meaning questions would be bad enough, but what was by far the worst part of this whole mess was some fans who were brazen enough to suggest that the developer should be willing to work on the game for free if need be, to finish the final season of The Walking Dead so the fans could get the game they felt they were owed. This notion, rightfully so, did not go over very well. Now, all this being said, there were also many fans that flocked to social media to show their support for the workers of Telltale and the games they had made. Eventually, Telltale proper did announce they were in negotiations to have The Walking Dead's final season be completed by another studio, which ultimately led to Skybound Entertainment agreeing to finish production of the game with a team made up of mostly ex-Telltale employees. As of the writing of this video, the fourth and final episode of the season has just recently been released. Many former Telltale employees have moved on and found other employment, and hopefully all of the 250 people that lost their job by now have landed on their feet in one way or another. It appears that, with the conclusion of the last season of The Walking Dead, the story of Telltale, with all its ups and downs, is in many ways finally complete. And so far, I feel like I've done a pretty good job of covering most of the whats in this story, but I haven't really properly touched on a lot of the whys, and there is a reason for that. The problem is, if we're going to understand why Telltale ultimately shut down, well then, we need to start talking about money, which is yet another thing I'm absolutely not an expert on. But I have done what research I can to at least try and understand how money affected this particular situation. So I'm going to do my best, at the risk of overgeneralization, to explain what I do know, and yet again, put it as simply as I can. So, games cost money to make. I think we all know at least that much. But I doubt many of us on the fan side of things ever actually spend much time thinking about where exactly that money comes from. When we break it down, it's obvious that to make a game, you need to be able to pay the people who are actually going to end up developing it. But when we go to the store, whether that be in person or digitally to buy a game, we aren't really paying for that labor. Unless you're supporting a game that's being crowdfunded ahead of time, that work has largely already been done. Yes, you're paying for the finished product, but what that studio will actually far more likely use your money for, assuming they've been paying their employees properly up until this point, will be funding the development of their next game. So with this in mind, it stands to reason that if you're starting a game studio like Telltale was back in 2004, and you haven't released a game yet, but still need to pay designers to actually make that initial release, well then that money needs to come from somewhere. And since Telltale was founded as an independent studio, not owned by a larger publisher or console manufacturer, the usual place to find that kind of funding was from outside investors, which changes this equation up a bit. Now with this new mindset, making it a successful game that brings in lots of money is no longer about being able to pay current employees to make future games. It's now instead about paying back that initial loan you got, as well as making the studio look more profitable so you can attract new and even bigger investors. And here's the unfortunate thing about relying on investors: they're usually not content with just making enough money to cover salaries and get the next project off the ground. What they're looking for is a return on their investment, often with a hefty amount of interest. Super Bunny Hop already made a video that goes into much greater detail about where exactly Telltale drew their multiple rounds of funding from. So if that's something that interests you, that's the direction I'd point you in. But suffice it to say, Telltale started off with investments from fairly smaller venture capital firms, but as the studio scope and scale of operations started to grow, they began courting larger and more prominent investors. Making deals in the single millions wasn't really going to cut it anymore. Now they needed financing in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And the studio's livelihood was very much riding on management's ability to get those kinds of deals done. And, well, to be blunt about it, they didn't do that. What seemed to be the final nail in the coffin for Telltale was just before the studio's closure last September, when both of two potential investors pulled their money at the last second. The studio's executives had made all their future plans based on the assumption that they were absolutely going to get that money. And for a while there, they were feeling pretty good about their chances. After all, even if, say, one of their new partners were to get cold feet and change their mind, well, they always had that second investor lined up as a backup plan. But when both of them decided to pull out within a matter of hours of each other, well, they had no backup plan for the backup plan. So that basically covers the no severance and no healthcare part of the studio's closing, because this all happened very last minute and there just wasn't any money left to pay for those kinds of benefits. Well, that last part is probably more than a bit debatable. I'm sure there were at least a few golden parachutes for the executives that could have been downgraded to bronze class parachutes to allow them to do right by their employees. But that bit of editorializing will have to wait until later on in the video. The last thing we need to figure out is why no one was given any real kind of advance warning about how close to financial collapse the studio really was. And to be clear, it's not like the people working at Telltale were completely oblivious. Even from an outsider's perspective, it was obvious the studio was still on some shaky ground as they continued to rehab from years of mismanagement. But the widespread feeling seems to be that most employees were generally left in the dark about just how dire the company's financial situation really was. This part can vary depending on interpretation, but the simplest answer seems to be that executives were trying to play things as close to the vest as possible when making deals with investors. After all, if you're trying to convince someone to give you a lot of money, well then, the conventional wisdom says, regardless of how many things behind the scenes are being held together by scotch tape and string, you need to at least keep up the public appearance of everything being business as usual. Which in turn explains why the company would do something like, say, hiring new employees the same week they ended up going under. And the best reasoning I could find about why executives would be so tight-lipped about the studio's dire financials, even with the people that already work there, is that they were afraid if they let everyone in on the secret, then that information would go far beyond the walls of just their own office building, which subsequently would make the company look less attractive to potential partners. And so that, more or less, is how you end up in a situation where 250 people lose their jobs with no notice, no severance, and health insurance that expires in 9 days. But, as evidenced by that last part there, we're really starting to run out of the just the facts part of this story. If we're going to talk any further about what happened to Telltale as a studio, and maybe even find some potential ways to avoid something like this happening again, well then we're going to need to get a bit more philosophical. Because the facts of the matter seem to be, if those latest investors hadn't pulled out at the last minute, Telltale would probably still be around. But after everything we've learned up until this point, I can't help but ask the question, would that really be a good thing? Well, it's a bit unclear as to how much better things got at Telltale once Kevin Bruner was gone. Some said things improved quite noticeably, while others stated it was still mostly more the same. The thing I am definitely sure of is, I don't think anyone should have to go through the kind of treatment the employees at Telltale were subjected to. Regardless of how much I might enjoy the end product, no game is worth anything close to the kind of human toll that kind of development demands. And so I'm left to wonder, say Telltale was still around, what kind of studio would it look like? They'd still be relying on outside investors to fund development, which, as I already laid out, is a process that can be dangerously cyclical. On a long enough timeline, you either survive long enough to just get bought wholesale by a larger company, or keep playing a game of financial Russian roulette by borrowing more and more money until you eventually just can't pay back your loans anymore. So much like how Telltale's release schedule had resulted in the studio existing in a perpetual state of crunch, continuously relying on outside financing means being constantly on the hook to deliver that next big hit, which adds a lot of extra pressure to the situation. So while I am happy that some people reported improved working conditions under Telltale's new management, in the back of my mind I keep thinking, how long would it really have taken for the studio to backslide into old habits? Well, I guess the answer to that question depends a lot on how much you trust the executive team that was in place at the time of Telltale's closing. And based on how they handled that particular situation, personally I would say not that much. Clearly they value their responsibility to their shareholders over their ability to take care of their employees. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been willing to risk so many people's livelihoods on brokering these high-level deals. And this is, I suppose, where we start to get into the trickier philosophical territory. Because technically speaking, Pete Howley and the executive team at Telltale Games didn't do anything legally wrong, or if they did, it was at least in a legal gray area. So if you have an issue with how those executives handled the studio shutdown, and for the record, I certainly do, what we have here is, at least for the time being, more an issue of morality as opposed to legality. Because as far as I'm aware, there was nothing in their contracts that meant Telltale was obligated to offer employees any of the benefits I've listed so far upon termination. And yet, that is something that a lot of companies, even in the gaming industry, do offer. But the main difference between these two scenarios is, in those other cases, those benefits are usually offered as a courtesy as opposed to a requirement, and most of those other companies are doing fairly well instead of being in the middle of closing up shop altogether. Now, this doesn't mean Telltale couldn't have offered these benefits to their employees, they just decided it wasn't a priority. I don't know enough of the particulars of how Telltale was run. I don't know if they were using every last dollar to keep the lights on as long as possible so they could get that last minute deal done, or if they were just saving a nice chunk of cash to make sure their people at the very top landed on their feet. Either way, I wholeheartedly believe that if providing severance and health insurance to those 250 people was important to them, the executive team absolutely could have made it happen, but they specifically chose not to. Now, we could certainly quibble about what compels people in positions of power to make such callous decisions like this, but regardless of if you see this as a result of ingrained corporate apathy or just outright malice on the part of executives, either way, if you look at this from the perspective of someone who lost their job because of this mess, I would assume litigating these distinctions feels, in effect, pretty meaningless. And when you take a step back even further, it seems fairly clear to me that the root of this problem is far more systemic than it is interpersonal. The issues that Telltale faced are issues that most companies, both big and small, have to deal with, and that's an issue of power. Okay, so this next point is something very important that I need to make sure I'm clear about, and I feel like I just need to be as blunt as possible here. If you're a CEO at a game company, at the most basic level, your job is not to make games. Your job is to make money. Yes, these CEOs might specifically have been hired because they have a history of making games, a love of playing games, and possess first-hand knowledge of what the people who play games actually want. But ultimately, they do not answer to us, and they do not answer to their employees. They answer to the people that pay them. In other words, they answer to the investors. Fundamentally, their job is to make rich people richer by selling a product. And the fact that games are specifically what they are selling is honestly, at that point, incidental. And this is why I say the issue is largely systemic. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the typical pyramid-like structure of corporate hierarchies and how, on an individual level, the people at the bottom have far less power than the people at the top. But the other half of this issue is that responsibility is always something that flows upward, but never downward. If you're an entry-level employee, then you answer to your manager, who in turn answers to the executives, who then have to answer to their investors. Which explains why even if you take a studio like Telltale and change out the CEO, you still haven't fixed the real underlying problem here. Sure, maybe the new boss is willing to improve some of the bad working conditions, but that is usually out of a desire for efficiency, not empathy. Telltale was a prime example of how badly this system can let down so many people. This is how you get a situation where someone is willing to gamble with 250 people's livelihoods. Because if that's what is going to make the board of directors more money, well then, that is exactly the kind of thing CEOs get paid to do. But the sad truth is, regardless of what I think, to many this is just seen as the way things are, the cost of doing business. Sure, Telltale is certainly one of the most egregious examples of a studio mistreating its employees, but they were an outlier, a worst-case scenario. Well, I would counter that notion by saying, if we zoom out and take a broader look at the landscape of game development as a whole, we can see that in general, this is a story that, while certainly extreme, is far from uncommon. What happened to Telltale is just a small piece of a much bigger story, and if we're going to figure out what we can learn from this particular example, we need to start looking at its broader context. It's probably worth mentioning, if you haven't already figured it out, this video stopped being just about Telltale Games a while ago. But it also isn't only about the video game industry either. While I'm going to keep talking about these kinds of issues as they pertain to games specifically, obviously they're not symptoms solely isolated to just this field, or even the tech industry at large, but rather capitalism as a whole. And I know capitalism is one of those no-no words that brings out all the angry comments, but if you made it this far, I'm assuming you're willing to go with me just a little bit further. So clearly, due to all the reasons I gave at the beginning of this video, the story of Telltale is something that has a lot of personal significance to me. But there are tons of other stories like this one out there. The very same month Telltale shut down, two other notable studios closed, Carbine Studios and Capcom Vancouver, leaving approximately 50 and 150 more people out of a job respectively. And while I am by no means happy about either of those closings, I also have to sadly admit neither of them hit me anywhere near as hard as Telltale did, primarily due to a lack of that personal investment. But I guarantee you, there is someone out there who was a huge fan of WildStar or Dead Rising, someone that felt the same way about those studios going away as I felt about Telltale. But I guess that's the fickleness and privilege of being a fan. It's not our job we're losing, it's not our paycheck that's going away. It doesn't mean we're devoid of empathy, but for it to really hit home, for it to really stick with us, we also need to lose something that we formed a deeper attachment to, something we truly loved. Because here's another ugly truth, I had to look up and remind myself who Carbine Studios even was. I remembered Capcom Vancouver closing, and I was pretty sure I remembered there was a third studio that closed that September, but I couldn't actually recall who they were. It's only been a matter of months, and the stories are already starting to blend together or just be forgotten outright. And this stuff, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The final straw that inspired me to start making this video was when Activision Blizzard, despite claiming they, quote, once again achieved record results in 2018, laid off over 800 employees of February of this year, double the amount of people that were laid off from Telltale, Capcom, and Carbine combined. And in the couple of months since I started working on this video, even more closings and layoffs have been reported on. Also in February, ArenaNet closed its Bellevue studios, another 150 people without employment. The following month, EA laid off 350 of their own employees, and the month after that, QC Games shuttered, approximately 45 more jobs gone. Layoffs within the gaming industry have become so frequent that there's now a Twitter account whose sole function is to track just how often people are losing their jobs in this industry. So far in 2019, over 2,000 game workers have been laid off, and as of the writing of this video, we've yet to go more than a full month without some form of a major job loss or a studio closure. And the sad part is, these are mostly just the major layoffs that hit the big news sites, and the main reason they're considered newsworthy in the first place isn't really even because people lost their jobs. It's because the loss of jobs didn't come when they usually do. For one reason or another, they were off schedule. Game development, especially at big studios, relies on a lot of contract work, and at the end of most big projects, a significant chunk of that workforce is let go. And this is all, once again, largely just accepted as how the system works. But those are all real people who are now without jobs. Even if, unlike the workers at Telltale, all of them were given some form of a severance package, even if losing their job was an eventuality that they could at least partially plan for, that loss of work still has consequences, and it causes many to abandon game development altogether. Finding a new job in this field can often mean relocating, and as you get older, and it isn't just you having to do the moving, that stress can add up. There's only so many times you can ask a partner to move to a new city and find a new job. There's only so many times you can tell your kids they have to go to a new school and make new friends. I honestly try and put myself in those shoes, and I hope I'm not being insensitive here, but I can't stop myself from wondering how many times can you ask your loved ones to uproot their lives for your career before you start to feel like you're just being selfish, and before you start looking for a job in a more stable industry. And this is just how one of the many issues that plagued Telltale Games, which at one point seemed like an isolated incident, was actually a microcosm of an industry-wide problem. Every time someone gets burnt out by the gaming industry, that's valuable knowledge you don't get back. That's experience that isn't easy to replace and usually isn't. This is why when members of the old guard have finally had enough and move on, they are often replaced with younger and more ambitious workers that haven't had the burden of changing jobs 4 times over the last 10 years weighing them down. And for so many of them, this cycle continues until those new recruits eventually become the weary veterans themselves, and they exit the industry just like their predecessors did. There are undoubtedly some who do find this kind of lifestyle agreeable for them. I certainly did when I was younger and didn't know any better. What is usually described in buzzwords as a fast-paced, upwardly mobile, and hyper-focused working environment can be attractive, especially if you don't have a family you need to support. It can be cathartic, especially when you have all that young energy to throw around, to submerge yourself in your work, to put everything you have into doing a good job. But that isn't something that is realistic for everyone. Just because someone values their time with their family, or maybe has a health condition that doesn't allow them to work 80 hours a week, that doesn't mean they can't be a valuable member of a studio. And these are all just the problems that revolve around people leaving the industry, but there are just as many stories being reported about the terrible working conditions for those who are still employed at game companies as well. Over the past 6 months, reports have been filed about rampant crunch culture at studios such as Rockstar, BioWare, Epic, and NetherRealm. Meanwhile, at Riot Games, over 100 employees staged a walkout in protest against management's mishandling of workplace harassment allegations. Gearbox CEO Randy Pitchford's legal troubles and numerous Twitter meltdowns has largely dominated Borderlands 3's announcement, essentially overshadowing all of his employees' hard work. CD Projekt Red, another studio with a reputation for relying heavily on crunch, even went so far as to try and get out in front of any potential stories by doing an interview with Kotaku, stating that they, quote, would like for us to also be known for treating developers with respect, while at the same time not committing to eliminating crunch from their overall management strategy. Clearly, at least as it pertains to crunch, Telltale was not even an edge case, but instead an example of what we should probably all start assuming is the norm for every studio unless explicitly reported otherwise. So even as an outsider, I have to feel like this bigger picture we've uncovered doesn't really look like that of a healthy industry. At the very least, this looks like an industry that could be so much better, that could be so much more accommodating to so many more people. And look, obviously, I'm just one Yahoo with a YouTube channel, and I don't want to pretend like I have the perfect solution to all these many issues I've brought up so far. But the truth is, I do know of one way the world of game development, or really technology in general, could at least start to make their way down the path to improvement. But it's also something that is, to put it mildly, rather contentious. But you know what? Screw it. We're going to talk about it anyway. So I do need to get one last disclaimer out of the way before we dive into this topic, but this time I'm not going out of my way to clarify that I'm not an expert with first-hand knowledge of how unions work. For the record, I'm also not trying to insinuate that I am an expert on unionization either. It's just more that that's not the point I want to be sure I'm clarifying here. I'm sure you could feel this already creeping in around the edges of what I've had to say so far, but I definitely have my own personal opinions about unions and the effectiveness of them. And I'm not going to try and hide that from you. In fact, I would urge you to be wary of anyone saying they're giving you the unbiased and objective facts about how unions work, because yes, whether intentional or not, everything is political, including us. We all have our own beliefs, ideologies, and perspectives, and they affect the way we see things and understand them. They help us define what we think is important information to include, and what aspects are ancillary and thus okay to leave out. There's no such thing as an objective view of this matter, so with this in mind, all I really want to do is describe for you how I personally feel the process of unionization could make games better by making their creators better. And furthermore, I want to try and frame this discussion from a fan's perspective, because while there is plenty of writing out there about the positives and negatives as it relates to game developers, I actually haven't seen a whole lot of conversation around how fans specifically play a meaningful part in this equation. Alright, so now that we have all that established, let's talk about unions. Well, okay, first off, since I did just state that my target audience for this part of the video is specifically other fans, I suppose I should probably make sure we're all on the same page here and go over, on at least a very basic level, how a union actually works. Apologies to any of you out there who already know this stuff like the back of your hand, but I do think it's important I cover this for anyone new to the topic. If you feel like this is going to be redundant information for you, there are timestamps to skip to the next section in the description. Alright, so remember this diagram from earlier? One of the key problems we pointed out with this system is that on a person-by-person basis, there is an unequal amount of power being distributed to those at the very top of this pyramid. Thankfully, unions are a great way to try and combat this kind of power imbalance by allowing everyone at the bottom to pull their individually relatively small amount of power together. But what does this actually look like in action? Well, usually once a union is formed, then that union, often represented by a few elected members, will negotiate with one or multiple companies to create what is essentially a contract, deeming what any company who hires on union workers can and cannot ask their employees to do. This process is commonly referred to as collective bargaining. Now, while these kinds of negotiations happen all the time, if you're a person outside that given industry, probably the only time you'll hear about a particular union is when it goes on strike, which is the second major way workers can exert their power. In most cases, a union will go on strike during the initial negotiations after a union has been formed, or when the current labor agreement between the union and their employer is about to expire and a new deal has yet to be reached. If we use game development again as our example, and look at the dichotomy between worker and manager, we can pretty easily see why going on strike is the most effective way to achieve any sort of lasting change. If you're a single developer at a big AAA studio, more than likely the only thing you have much control or ownership over is your ability to do your job. In contrast, the executives often have a lot more assets under their control. They probably own or at least rent the office space you work in, they provide the computers and equipment you use to make games, and most importantly, they almost always own the rights to the games you create. They decide how it is marketed, where it is sold, and they also are most definitely going to be the ones who stand to profit if the game actually sells well. So really, as a worker, your skill at actually making games is basically the only leverage you have to bargain with. Thus why unions often choose to go on strike when companies refuse to negotiate. This is also why it's important that unions are collectively made up of as many workers as possible. Going on strike is really only an effective tactic if everyone agrees to do it. Even if the executives at a company have actual experience making games, there's almost never a situation where there are enough managers on staff to operate the company by themselves. So if the company wants to get back to doing business, they either need to reach an agreement with a union or hire outside non-union workers, colloquially referred to as scabs or scab labor. Some benefits unions provide for their members are restrictions on how long an employer can ask someone to work and ensure that workers are paid overtime if they do work more than the agreed upon limit, employer-provided healthcare, safer working conditions both physically and mentally, as well as other benefits like paying severance upon termination, and generally higher pay and more regular raises. In other words, a lot of the things the video game industry is sorely lacking right now. Okay, so now that we have all this established, it's time to go back and talk about how exactly fans can factor into all of this. For real this time. There's a quote from a former Telltale employee that I haven't been able to get out of my head while working on this video. The things that you love are made by people. We're people just like you. We're people that are living paycheck to paycheck, working our asses off to make the content that you love. Enjoy the content that you have, but don't forget the people that made it. And with all due respect to this employee, I have to disagree with them. Like, I understand what they mean when they say, we're people just like you. Game developers are people too, and they deserve just as much respect as anyone else, which, obviously, of course I agree with. But unfortunately, I think the thing they say after this is the far more important part of that statement. We're people that are living paycheck to paycheck, working our asses off to make the content that you love. And for a lot of fans, especially the younger ones, that's a life experience that is, in most cases, pretty unrelatable. And I'm not trying to be judgmental here or act like I'm speaking from a place of moral superiority. When I was 16, I absolutely wasn't thinking about where my favorite games came from or how they were made. And this didn't mean I was incapable of empathy, I was just lucky enough that I hadn't reached a point in my life yet where I knew what it was like to worry about paying rent or access to good health insurance. And this disconnect between fans and creators is a bit concerning to me because it enables a lot of what I'll politely call naive perspectives on these kinds of matters. The thing that frustrates me the most about the fans that were demanding Telltale prioritize finishing The Walking Dead over paying their employees severance is that I see this as a behavior that has largely been very carefully and deliberately conditioned into us. Think about it, how many times have you been watching an E3 press conference and seen something like this?
I would like also to thank you all the gamers. We are only here because of you.
Thank you all our fans, all of you, for your support and for making PlayStation one of the most loved brands in the world.
Thanks for being with us, and thanks for the incredible privilege of making games for all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's impossible to watch an E3 press conference as a fan and not hear how special and important we are, how it is a privilege to make games for us, how they simply couldn't do it without us. And quite frankly, I can't help but find this more than a little bit patronizing. I mean, I don't know how to make a game. Sure, I'm great at paying for the games I play, but I don't really consider myself a fundamental part of the game-making process. And this is in no small part because, as we've already mentioned, in a lot of cases, the money I'm providing is only in rare instances paying for the direct development of the game I'm buying. So really, it's hard to feel like the statement, "we couldn't do this without you," is anything more than pandering and disingenuous marketing speak. This strategy is a pretty blatant attempt to make us as fans feel like an important step in the development process. I know this is a bit of a loaded term these days, but it's hard to view this approach to talking to your audience as anything other than building consumer entitlement. And the thing is, for the most part, this approach, it works. But whether it's intentional or not, this way of selling a product also benefits corporate interests far more than it does workers. The truth is, even if we don't know it yet, fans are not an independent party in this equation. When I try and look at the future and envision what the process of unionizing game development would actually look like, it's hard for me not to imagine companies trying to fight it tooth and nail, and one of the biggest weapons they'll likely try to use is us. If game devs were to unionize, that more than likely means there will almost certainly be a workers' strike, which in turn will result in serious delays for most, if not all of our most anticipated games. And at that point, given the current state of things, I have a pretty good idea who we're going to blame for this. I'll give you a hint, it's the people who actually make the games, not the people that just make the money. In this scenario, it's easy for executives to point the finger at developers. After all, they're the ones interrupting the status quo. The talking points basically write themselves. The executives will try to paint themselves as the good guys here and try to turn the fans against the newly unionized workers because, well, it's undoubtedly a pretty smart strategy. While preserving the status quo will certainly benefit the executive class in the long run, I also can't deny that in the short term, it benefits us as well. And this is just the first thing that comes to mind. Another common rebuttal I see to unionization is that unions will lead to games getting more expensive. If companies now have to take into account paying for things like healthcare and other benefits, well, that money does have to come from somewhere. This is why when someone who is anti-union is trying to tell you that a unionized workforce will lead to costs being dumped onto us, the consumer, they are more than likely absolutely right. Because that's another tactic companies can use to win the publicity war. If we start having to spend $70 or $80 for our games, who do you think we're going to send angry tweets at? But the important thing to remember is, things don't have to play out this way if we don't want them to. We can choose a different ending, to walk a different path. If games do get more expensive, that extra cost doesn't have to be passed on to us. It could instead come out of the wallets of the executives of these companies that make seven-figure salaries. If or when a game gets delayed because of a strike, we could blame the executives for not taking care of their employees in the first place. Whether it's fair or not, our voices do matter, and we get to decide how to use them. I'm not going to lie to you, unions are not an easy fix to all the problems I've cited in this video. Unions are not a cure-all, they're not a solution, they're a tool. They're the starting point to finding a solution, but not the end point. But that being said, I do truly believe with all my heart, this is something the gaming industry needs. We need more than just putting out job listings every time a big studio decides hundreds of employees aren't in this year's budget anymore. We need more than hashtags. We need more than sobering Twitter accounts. Unions aren't perfect, and if they were actually to be implemented in this industry, it would undoubtedly be a messy process. But I have to ask you, after everything we've gone over up to this point, how much worse can unions really make things? I know I already said this, but I think it bears repeating. I'm not trying to tell you how to think here. I'm sure there are plenty of people who, even after making it this far in the video, still don't find unions to be a worthwhile effort, and while I'm not okay with that, I've at least made peace with it. I'm not trying to deceive anyone, and throughout the writing of this, I tried my best to give an honest perspective of why I think game workers unionizing would be a beneficial thing for all of us. If you still disagree with this, well then fine, but I just hope that you know why you disagree with it. Without a doubt, I'm going to miss Telltale. Even though I wasn't always in love with everything they put out, it felt good knowing they were out there as an advocate for story-centric games. In the process of making this video, I finally got around to playing the final season of The Walking Dead, and I could not be any happier to say it was better than I could have ever hoped for. It was certainly bittersweet to write my own final chapter in my personal story with Telltale Games, but at the very least, I'm glad my last memory with the studio was a positive one. But the good news is, Telltale is not entirely gone either. Sure, as a company, as a physical place where the employees of that studio go to work every day to make games as a group of creative individuals, that version of Telltale is gone. But the memories they created with each other, and with all of us, still remain. For the handful of talented people that did make it out of Telltale to start their own studios, and for the many more that have now been scattered to the winds to hopefully find better footing with new teams, they'll continue to carry that banner. And that isn't even mentioning how many fans they made throughout the studio's lifetime either. Even with the most generous of tallies, the number of people that at some point worked at Telltale Games over those 14 years can't be more than a couple thousand, but all of us, the fans, We number in at least the hundreds of thousands. I know it's a bit corny to say this, but just through sheer size, we have just as much power to keep the memory of Telltale alive, and to ultimately determine what their legacy will be. As I already mentioned earlier, Telltale was maybe one of the most egregious and high-profile collapses of a studio that we've seen in recent memory, but they aren't an anomaly. I've already shown you that they weren't the last company to have massive layoffs or just go under altogether. And I'm not naive enough to believe that any of the stories I mentioned in this video will be the final endpoint in this timeline before we see some real change. As much as I wish Telltale could have been the final tipping point, as much as I feel like it should have been, it wasn't. But the silver lining is, I am starting to feel like that last straw is coming, and perhaps faster than anyone could have guessed. And when that time comes, we as fans, we have one last important choice to make. We have to decide, do we want to stand in the way of progress, or do we want to get behind the car and push? Ultimately, we're all going to have to decide which side we're on, and just like in a Telltale game, not choosing a side is a valid option, but please also know, it isn't a neutral one. You need to ask yourself, who benefits from your silence, and you need to ask yourself, what is more important to you, the games you play, or the people who make them? I'm sure it's abundantly clear by now, I already know which side I'm falling on, and that is in no small part because of my love for Telltale Games. As a fan, there's nothing I could have done to stop the closing of Telltale. I couldn't have prevented the poor decisions that studio's management made. That is an arena where I have no power. But I also choose to not stand in the way, or be used as a tool to fight against those that do have the power to effect real change. And it is my sincerest hope, from one fan to another, when your time comes to make this same decision, that you don't sit on the sidelines, that you make it count. I know it's easy to feel like you don't factor into this equation, that your choice doesn't matter, but I promise you it does. Don't ever forget the power you wield, and don't ever forget you always have a choice. Alright, that sure was a lot, huh? So this is the part of the video where you would normally see the credits for all my supporters on Patreon, but I don't really have any of those yet. Mostly because I'm launching it as of like right now. But if that is something that you would be interested in, well, there's a link in the description and at the end of this video. But what I really want to use this time for is to take a moment and give a formal thank you to everyone who ever worked at Telltale. If you ever worked at the studio and this video somehow reached you, I want to personally thank you for being a part of making games that were not only a joy to play, but also reignited my love for games altogether. I know for some of you, these particular wounds might still be fresh, and I tried my best to use your story not in an exploitative nature, but as a potential teaching tool to, with any luck, make the gaming world just a little bit better. Hopefully, I did your story justice. Also, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all my friends and colleagues that provided voiceovers and read the quotes you heard. The video absolutely would have been worse off without them, and links to their channels can also be found in the description below. And before I go, I usually feel uncomfortable doing this because my videos are mostly just me rambling about my feelings on a certain piece of media for around 10 to 20 minutes, but if you enjoyed the video and it helped you understand either the disastrous effects of crunch culture, the fraught nature of how games are often financed, or just how unions could potentially work, and you think it might help someone else understand any of these things too, then please consider sharing the video anywhere you can. This is by far the biggest video I've made in every sense of the word, and for the first time, I feel like a video of mine could actually be a valuable resource for doing some actual good in the world. So it'd be nice to see it reach as many people as possible. Alright, that's pretty much all I have for you. I'll be back sometime in the near future with a hopefully much shorter video, but until then, I'll just say my name's Drew, and you've been watching Select Screen.